all of us share this very human hunger. What I want to emphasize about being intentional is that you don't have to feel guilty for being lonely. You don't have to feel guilty for feeling lonely. People will say you should not feel lonely because you should be totally happy in Jesus Christ. You can be both lonely and totally content in Christ. The topic we're going into this with is the idea of letting God do his will or being intentional in dating. And these two sort of approaches they bear on every aspect of Christian life. It's not just about dating, but it really involves every aspect of your spiritual life as a Christian. So let's go through those options one at a time. Option A, as we might sort of look at it, says, let go and let God. That's the idea. Essentially, what you're supposed to do is sit back, depend on the will of God, and see what happens. If he wants you to have a husband or a wife, he'll do it, but otherwise, your duty is not to step in. And let's take option B, which is to be hyper intentional about this. Take efforted, intentional, thought through, and responsible steps to go and date because you know it's not going to happen if you don't do anything. So there's two approaches that I could take to all this. I could go ahead and take one side and just say, this is the right one, go and do that. I want people who lean more into letting go and letting God to see the merits in thinking intentionally and with effort about your dating life. And I want people who are prone to that, putting in the effort and going after it, to see the merits in having the peace of knowing that God's will be done. The merits of this is that where you're finding your identity, if you say, my approach to dating is going to be to let God's will be done, is that you're embracing the fact that you have peace in Jesus Christ. Your identity is a settled matter in him. You are his son or his daughter, and you don't gain value by becoming married. And although it might be something you want, your real joy is Christ. And so it's not something you go out and desperately search for. If you're approaching the Lord as a single person, you're seeing the fact that you're single as your identity. It's not your entire identity, but it's certainly part of it. And in the same way that Paul earlier in this text says it's not sin to go out and get married, he does say there's a value in identifying the way that you were called to the Lord, which, as most of it is going to be as a single person, and being content to remain that way. The value behind this is that you're not gaining value or merit with God by going and getting married. He doesn't prize married people over single people. So you have a place where you are most valuable, and that is in the eyes of Christ. And you have nothing to gain in that value by going and getting married, even if it's something you want. And that's what we call this peace. You are content to be in Christ. But here's the danger of this position. Here's where things might get difficult. We often make the mistake, sinfully, of mistaking having peace for being passive. Those are two very different things. Having peace is different than being passive. Having peace means you understand that Christ has bought you with a price, and you don't need to earn anything else to be valuable in his sight and to be a wonderful piece of God's handiwork. Being passive means that you're not going to do anything because God's going to do whatever he is, regardless of what you do. Let me put it this way. You won't be preventing God's will by going on a date. In the same way that somebody who goes out and starts dating isn't forcing their will upon God, you won't be letting God do his will if you stay home and don't go on dates. Because here's the reality. You're not going to miraculously wake up one day with a spouse next to you. That's not going to happen. That requires intentional steps. That requires effort. So letting God's will happen isn't a matter of just sitting back, doing nothing, and waiting for somebody to come to you. It's just how life works. It's resting in the peace of Christ, but it's not being passive to the point where you go and do nothing. You actually have to put in the effort. So let's talk about that effort. We talked about that letting go and letting God. Said, let's talk about being intentional. If we talked about the peace of God being the best part of letting go and letting God, Let's think about the merits of being intentional, because so far it might have seemed like that's the wrong call. For some of us, the aspects of being intentional in our dating might be pretty obvious. You go on dates, you set your priorities for someone you like to be with, and you put your best foot forward. You prepare for these things. And for a lot of us, it's not obvious. That can be quite difficult. We would love it if God would just deliver a spouse to our door, and that's that. And then we're good to go. But that's not it. And whether you feel prepared for this and it's obvious of how being intentional about dating works or it's not, all of us share this very human hunger. What I want to emphasize about being intentional is that you don't have to feel guilty for being lonely. You don't have to feel guilty for feeling lonely. I found it to be the case in a lot of Christian circles that people will say you should not feel lonely because you should be totally happy in Jesus Christ. You can be both lonely and totally content in Christ. Let's look back to Genesis 2. So God made Adam, the first person in the world, single person. And in this beautiful good garden that Adam was at that time enjoying, and with the presence of God, and with every type of food and all the creatures on the earth, Adam was discontent in his loneliness. And God said, it is not good that man should be alone. It wasn't that God said, it is good that man should be alone, and Adam needs to get used to it. He said, it is not good that man should be alone. And when he does give Eve to Adam, what you get is this beautiful piece of poetry from Adam, who says, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And you have this verse in Ecclesiastes 4:9, two are better than one, because they will have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? Loneliness is not fun, and it's not wrong to go and seek a wife. Even in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul said, it is good that man should be alone, but says it's not sin for a man to go and get married. So I want to press into this principle here and show us that even though it's good to go and be intentional, the danger is in relinquishing that peace we talked about earlier. The danger is in giving up that peace of being totally content in Christ and in saying my value lies in my ability to attract someone who will be my spouse. You see how that works? So in both instances, we can find that we're susceptible to place our identity in whether we're single or not, and not in the fact that we've been saved and bought by Jesus Christ, that we've been adopted by him. So now that I've sort of made both camps a bit uncomfortable, that you can see the dangers in both trying to be peaceful and also see the dangers in being intentional, I want to tie these two together. So first, I want to be able to show us that the way we're approaching dating means taking the best of both. What this means is not trying to rush into the finish line, but to take time and care to settle for nothing less than somebody who wants your faith to absolutely flourish. And to be sure that this is your intention for your partner as well. That you're embracing the fact that you're going to be intentional and you're going to take responsible steps here, but you're also going to live in the peace of Christ. It means that you're taking the best of both these camps and applying them to dating. But we have a more pressing concern, because everything I've talked about so far has to do with the future. Everything I've gone over so far has to do with what happens in the future. And this is where we stumble the most, I think, as single people, is we keep thinking of what will life be like when I'm married. But your life is happening right now. Whatever you're calling in the future is right now. Right now, you're called to be a single Christian, and you're called to obey as that single Christian. So I want to apply these principles to life right now. In both these camps, first, this means understanding the will of God is sovereign, pure, and powerful. Charles Spurgeon once said this. He said that, remember this, had any other condition been better for you than the one in which you are in, divine love would have put you there. You can have peace in Christ, knowing that God has put you where you are intentionally, purposefully, and powerfully. It's not your duty to fight into a better position. Find out how you can serve the Lord now. But there's also the joy of being intentional. Obedience isn't about passivity and just submitting. Loving your neighbor and loving the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength means actively seeking ways you can use your gifts and abilities to help and care for your community, family, and friend group that you're in now. So with everything I've talked about, I want you to embrace this idea of the peace of Christ for the future. Be intentional about what your goals are in a responsible, God-honoring way, but realize how important those things are right now. Rest in the peace of Christ today and be intentional today, not only about your dating life, but every way in which you can use your gifts, talents, and abilities to serve the kingdom